Hello and welcome back again. It's time for another Zoom chat for the Pocono Liars Club. This time our guest is Pab Sungenis. Hi, Pab.
Hello.
Pab is a writer, playwright, and comic strip artist. So, Pab, I'm going to give you a chance to say hello to everybody and describe your work and tell them how they can find you on the web and that sort of thing.
I do a little bit of everything. I'm a broadcaster as well, and we like to joke that I'm the station's utility infielder because I do whatever is needed. I am a playwright. I finished two plays, one a gay sex farce and the other an extremely dark comedy about six friends at three funerals. And I'm working on a couple of others right now. I lost track. I think I'm currently working on my seventh novel, one of which was published by someone else, and four of which I published myself. And I do a daily comic strip for Andrews McMeel's syndication. They're the same people who distribute Garfield and Peanuts, so I'm in good company. And it's called The New Adventures of Queen Victoria.
That's how I first became aware of you, of course. Our writers who are watching this probably aren't going to be that interested in the comic strip, but I am. Just how did that get started? How did you even, contact anyone and say, hey, I've got a comic strip, you know?
I grew up years ago, back in the 70s, reading Peanuts and Pogo collections.
Pogo, oh my God.
And
lots of Pogo books.
And it really influenced me, and I wanted to be a cartoonist. So back in 79, I think it was, I just got a pad of paper and I drew a daily comic strip for my own amusement for about a year before I realized I had no talent in drawing. But I'd always wanted to do a comic strip again, but my art never got any better as I got older. Eventually, in 2006, I was just playing around with ULEAD Photo Impact, which no longer is distributed as a program, but I still use the last version because it has features I haven't found anywhere else. And I was just playing around, dragging around photos, and I thought, you could do a comic strip with this. So I started stockpiling clip art, and I was planning to do a comic strip called In the Land of Wonderful Clip Art, which was an homage to Winsor McCay, Little Nemo in the Land of Wonderful Dreams.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just going to be these random clip art images interacting and talking with each other in the land of clip art. And then, who was it? A writer called Ferret Steinmetz. I don't know if anyone knows of him. He also has done some cartooning, a few novels. But on his live journal, he was talking about why Garfield isn't funny, which is one of my favorite subjects because it just isn't. And I tend to think that it's not meant to be funny. I think that it's meant to just take up space, and that Jim Davis is laughing at everyone who thinks it's amusing and is buying all these books. But anyhow,
you put Garfield in your strip before, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've had Garfield as a guest in your strip as one of your...
Actually, I don't call him Garfield, obviously, but the very first strip, actually, I had an image I drew of Garfield making a weird face and just dropped it next to one I had of Queen Victoria. And her staring at him for 3 panels and then saying, "We are not amused." And I posted that as a comment to his live journal post talking about Garfield not being funny. And as a joke, I titled it The New Adventures of Queen Victoria. And just the next day, someone said, "Well, are you going to do any more?" So I did another, and then I did another, and now it's coming up on 15 years.
How many books have you published with the Queen Victoria comics?
I've put out 7 individual books before I had some financial problems and ended up losing my house and having to move. But let's see, it was We Are Not Amusing, Eichen Has Empire, Norton Hears a Who and Other Stories, Suffragettes Gone Wild, The Real Housewives of Windsor, Unamused Birds, and Lie Back and Think of the Blender. I had 7. I collected the first 3 because they were in really teeny books to begin with, because I was doing them at 72 DPI. And then when I started doing them designed for print, I went with a larger book. But I'm actually planning a Kickstarter in the next month or so to put out a collection with the other 4 books and to finally get book number 8, The Waltzing Dead, into print.
All right, so let's move on, because obviously our panelists, our guests want to hear about books and plays. Sorry, I went off on that tangent. You've also self-published a bunch of books, but you also have one that was with a publisher.
Right.
Give us your opinion about self-publishing versus using a publisher.
Using a publisher, it's a lot easier. It saves a lot of the work that you're going to have to do if you self-publish. The publicity is the biggest thing. Dealing with printers, they set you up with artists, that sort of thing, for covers. They connect you with editors. They do all the drudge work. Whereas some self-titled books, you can tell that they're self-published because they just write them and then they put them right out. They don't take the time to edit.
Well,
they don't do any of the stuff that a publisher would normally do.
Well, it depends on which small publisher you use, because I've also seen stuff from some small publishers that was absolutely terrible as well.
Well, that's the case. It's going to be different from publisher to publisher.
How did you find your publisher?
She actually found me. What happened was she ran a weekly chat on Twitter called Young Adult Literature Chat. And they had a contest with a publisher looking for what they called new adult books, which they thought was going to be the next big thing, with characters from 18 to 26 or so, to try to get the people who grew up reading Harry Potter reading as adults. And it unfortunately never took off, but I had a manuscript that I'd written that could have qualified as a new adult novel. So I submitted it and I came in 3rd in the contest. So she had remembered me, and the publisher who was running the contest considered it and they rejected it. But I kept in touch with her, and when I was writing my next novel, which was called Sidekick, she asked if I could send her the manuscript, and I did, and then suddenly she offered to buy it and a sequel that I had no interest in doing. but offering to pay me to do something, yeah, okay.
Well, that comes down to what we've talked about a lot in our group, which is how important networking is, and finding people, who can be interested in your stuff. Sitting back and just writing it by yourself doesn't get you as good as making the contacts that you need.
Right.
Yeah. Someone's asking, what kind of novels? Tell us about them. What kind of subjects? Science fiction, fantasy, horror? What?
They're a mixed lot, except for the one that could be called new adults. They're all young adults, just because I have an easier time dealing with younger characters. It's easier to explain why they screw up than it is with adults. So if you need to do something interesting, it's easier to do it with teens.
Alex, what's the word like for most of these? How long do they end up tend to be? Because young adult's not quite the same. Yeah.
The shortest that was out there is Go to Hell, which is 49,000 words. And I wrote that in a 21-day marathon because my agent wanted something different. So I said, okay, give me a couple weeks. And then I handed it off to her and she didn't like it.
So you sucked.
But eventually, yeah. But it was a concept I had loved. It's about a teenager, football jock, general dick toward other people who dies and is offered a job working for hell in this new guardian demon program that they're piloting. And he ends up not liking it, so he's trying to find his way out of it all. So that was 49,000. My longest one, I think, might have been Sidekick. Its first draft was 68,000 words. I think we got it down to 64,000 when we published. And the unpublished sequel to Sidekick was about 70,000.
Let's talk about trying to contact people. You've got a manuscript ready and you want to try to sell it. What have you done, especially these days when you really can't meet people? You can't really go to conventions. You can't really go to workshops. You have to do everything online.
Well, right after I wrote Sidekick and I was starting to look for an agent and publisher, I actually kept a blog that I called the Query Go Round, and I was documenting the querying process, explaining to people who had never done a query for an agent or a publisher how to structure it, how to lay it out, how to put your best foot forward, that sort of thing, and documenting as all the rejections came in, as the manuscript requests came in. And that's still probably the best way nowadays. If you don't have a track record, if you don't have connections, it's just blind query. Because eventually there are enough agents out there nowadays that you will probably find someone who is at least interested in it. And even if they don't end up representing you, they may point you in the right direction, or they may give you some tips on what to do the next time around. One
of the problems is there are so many blogs and newsletters and things out there these days. How do you make yours stand out? How do you get people to do you do a newsletter, for instance, for your fans?
I haven't since I started one when Sidekick was first out there, and that was an adventure. I was dealing with, I didn't realize that I was going to be the third book put out by this publisher, that I was a launch title that she had never run a publishing house before. And she called me with the good news that I'd been picked up by Barnes & Noble. But the problem was that it had been picked up. They had pitched it to the buyer at Barnes & Noble for the children's section, which is ages 7 to 12. And I'm saying, do they know that there's a sex scene in this book? Do they know that there is strong language? And this is a superhero book. It's got quite a bit of violence in it. And they were like, uh-oh. So that's one reason that it never really caught on, because the one huge bookseller that's left bought it and they couldn't move it.
Yeah. All right. So just going back and talking about blogs and podcasts and things, how do you promote yourself? What seems to work for you?
Well, I haven't really been pushing the self-published books. I just put them out there just so I have something. I know one of the first ones I wrote, and I had an agent who just couldn't sell it. In fact, one publisher, Phoebe Yeh, who was at Random House at the time, she actually called me and she said, I love this book, but there's no way in hell I could ever publish it. But we had a nice long chat. The title is A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Columbine. And it is a comedy about 5 school kids planning a mock school shooting and then leaving the country in its wake. And then it becomes the gang that couldn't shoot straight. Everything happens, you could imagine, to trip up these kids, including other kids actually launching a school shooting before they can get there.
So it's pretty a little black humor there, I'd say.
Yeah, very black, very black humor, but I had a lot of kids who just discovered it on their own and started posting quotes from it to Tumblr, and that's how that got most of the sales that I've gotten, is just from people who discovered it and then word of mouth. I've always said that I am one of the worst salespeople in the world. I have a hard time asking people for favors, asking people to do something for me. So I'm not really someone to go to for publicity for myself.
Got it.
So that's why I loved having a publisher who could handle the publicity and could get the book out there, who could line up interviews. That was always the hardest part for me.
Here's a question that someone has that I want to talk about, which is, you mentioned that age span, the 18 to 20, whatever, is that still being used? Do you know, or did that sort of drop off the face of the earth when it didn't really catch on? The new adult, whatever it was called?
The new adult was, it was Penguin Random House were experimenting with the term new adult, and I don't think anyone uses it anymore.
So none of us should be sending things out saying, hey, this is a new adult book to an agent, for instance. They're going to go, we don't care about
Well, I stopped calling it new adult and I started calling it cozy horror. Halfway through the pitching process, the name of the book, and it's one I still have not been able to give up on enough to put out by myself. It's called Mallbats. And the tagline for it was, working in retail sucks, literally. And it's for all of us schlubs who don't sparkle, was another line. So
I have a vampire book too that doesn't quite fit into the normal categories, if you're not aware of that. So yeah.
Right, the political thriller vampire novel. Right. That's the great thing about all the old genres, is you can bend them, you can apply them to whatever you want. But
it's hard to sell it. I mean, the agent who was trying to sell my book said, I can't, it's not a political thriller, it's not a vampire book, I don't know how to sell it. And that was my problem. But enough about me. Let's ask about plays, because that's what I really want to talk to you about.
Okay.
We've had lots of guests talk about these things before, but we've never had a playwright here. So let's say that one of us wants to write a play. How is writing a play different from writing a book? First of all, what do you have to do differently?
Okay, the first real concern with a play is unity of place. Unless you know you're going to have a multi-million-dollar budget and a theater big enough to bring in a turntable and swing actors out over the audience, that sort of thing, you have to keep all your action in one place.
Because we're trying,
whether it be
when you're writing, especially if you're not already famous, you're trying to get local theaters to put on your play, and hopefully it'll build and build from there, and they're not going to take something that's going to cost them a lot of money, correct?
Right, and they're not going to take anything that's not going to fit on their stage, which with most local theaters is a tiny little square with 100 seats maybe in the auditorium, and you have to try to keep your action confined into one space. I think really Neil Simon was the genius at this, because if you look at all of his successful plays, The Odd Couple, Brighton Beach Memoirs, Lost in Yonkers, they all take place in an apartment or a living room or someplace like that. And all the action comes to the audience. You have to take into account you're not going to be able to take too many jumps in time. You're not going to be able to change your set. At best, you may get to change it once at intermission, but even then, that's probably going to be minimal redressing of a set. So you have to keep it unity of place. The other thing is you generally are going to want, for the most part, unity of time. It all has to happen in real time. You can jump at a scene break or an act break. You can take a jump ahead, but you're generally going to want to have it as live action, just one line through line, so your audience can follow along.
No flashbacks, nothing like that.
No Sondheim writing, merely we roll along backwards, that sort of thing. Which, it's a nice concept, but the audience is going to go, huh? So that's your first concern, is you've got to keep it in one place, one time, and that's going to help you find a space to get it done.
Seems like the other concern is that you've got to pretty much give all your information out almost totally with dialogue. Oh,
yeah. Yeah, because most of your audience is not going to read the director's notes in the playbill. They're not even going to look at the playbill probably most of the time. And you have to try to explain things through dialogue. There is no exposition really in a play. If you try to do exposition, you're going to end up with an info dump, and it's just not going to feel natural. There are ways.
Not to say you can't break some of these rules, but if you're when you're starting out, you should try to,
Well, let's look at one of my favorite musicals. A funny thing happened on the way to the Forum.
Mm-hmm.
Right up front in the very first scene, they give you all the exposition, and they tell you that they're giving you the exposition. Or I recently directed a production of Scapan, where when they start giving all the expository dialogue, Scapan just says, "Oh wait," snaps his fingers, and someone rolls out a sign at the top of the stage that says exposition. Okay, go on.
Well, this is where you break the fourth wall and you actually literally talk to the audience and explain,
right.
Which is funny thing happened on the way to the Forum. And, there's actually quite a few plays that do that, but it doesn't always, it's almost only works in comedies, I would think, or actually maybe Our Town, where it's a narrator.
Right.
Yeah.
But Our Town is a unique work unto itself. It breaks just about every rule of playwriting. And it's genius because it breaks all those rules and it still works.
Have you ever tried to convert one of your books into a play?
No, because my books are just way too spread out. They're too long a plot. It's really hard to adapt a novel to a play or vice versa because they are such different creatures. Novels do make good musicals because musicals, you have certain tropes that let you work around the shortcomings of the theater, but in the end, it's hard to collapse 50 or 60,000 words of action into a 90 or 120 minute play. You're going to leave a lot out.
Well, let's say somebody has a book that mostly takes place in one spot.
Mm-hmm.
It's a cozy mystery or something like that.
Right.
How would they take that and turn that into a play? What advice would you give someone like that?
I would say first go through, and anything that is not absolutely vital to the plot, anything that could conceivably be jettisoned, cut it out. Just cut it right from the beginning, and then look at what you've got left. The next step after that, I would say, is just make a copy of your manuscript, and everything that isn't dialogue, cut it out. Cut out all of your expository text, cut out all of your scene dressing, just stick to your dialogue, because that's what the audience is going to hear. Then you can go back and say, okay, well, I have to mention that this happens, so you have a character, then in dialogue, mention that such and such happened, where you might have said 3 pages before that there was this horrible car crash and blah, blah, blah. Well, you would probably want to have something like one character just knocks on the door, comes running in, I just heard what happened. That sort of thing. Pare it down to the absolute minimum, then pare it down to just the dialogue, then add back in dialogue and action what you need, absolutely need to have.
How do you determine how long it should be? I mean, you can't really say it needs to be so many words. It's more like you have to read it and sort of time yourself and imagine it in your head.
Well, there is a sort of rule with standard stage play formats. It's similar to screenplay formats. And if you use a dramatic word processor for stage, right now I'm using one called Fade In, which is, it's sort of commercial, but there are free versions with some limited functionality. But it helps you keep track because it's more or less a page to a page and a half is 1 minute. So if you're going for a 90-minute play, you would want about 90 minutes. 120 minutes, you'd want about 120 pages. But the beautiful thing about the theater is that most of the time, there's nothing before you and there's nothing after you. So there's no scheduling concern like there is with film or television. Write it as long as it needs to be. And then the next step is the table read. You get people together and you record them reading your dialogue and someone else reading the stage instructions. And you start listening for stuff that is boring. If the play is dragging, then you just sit and cut. One of my favorite musicals is called Birds of Paradise. It's done on a sort of blank, empty stage. It's set at a local community theater. And one of the lines that I love in it is, the more he cuts, the better it gets. And that, sadly enough, is the case.
Well, that's
a lot of the time with
editing
plays.
novels sometimes too. You know, it's the same sort of thing. You cut it and it actually gets better. You know,
right? And if no one misses it, then you didn't need it in the first place.
And how does playwriting differ from screenwriting? I guess because playwriting, like you said, has to be in one place most of the time. Or screenwriting, you could have, you know, outdoor scenes and action scenes and things.
Screenwriting is visual. It is a visual medium. And stage plays are verbal. That's the main difference, because yeah, you can have a lot of physical comedy. If you're doing a farce, you can have emotional reactions, but it's the words that drive the plots.
And then how do you find the theater willing to put it on? Now you've written something. Where do you go if you're not already a community theater buff? How do you get someone interested?
There are a lot of theaters that are looking for new material. There are ones that are holding contests, some of which have fees, some of which don't. There are blogs out there that compile opportunities for dramatists who will publicize contests and publicize theaters that are looking for material. You might want to start looking for them. You could always Google just the words theater seeks scripts, just like agent seeks manuscripts. That might be a way. There are a lot of small theaters out there who want to do new material. They want to do something different, and they just put out the call, and sometimes you just have to take a leap of faith.
Do you get paid?
The other tactic, if you don't mind doing it all yourself, is there are festivals out there. One of my plays, Morning Has Broken, it's the one about 6 friends at 3 funerals. Mourning has broken. We took it to the Thespis Theater Festival in New York. I submitted the script, and they said, "Okay, this is great. Just pay this fee, and then you're going to direct and produce it yourself." And I went, "Okay." So basically, we just rented the theater for three performances. You might want to go down that route, but again, that you have to have at least some knowledge of the basics of theater, or have friends you can lean on who are involved in community theater, where you can say, "Hey, can you design some costumes? Hey, can you stage manage this production for me?" That sort of thing. And that's what I did. I leaned on a number of friends, and then they brought other friends in, and that's how that one happened. And my very first play, called Bearding the Lions, Lyons. Yeah, I like puns in my titles, if you couldn't figure that out. I wrote it just because I'd had just one of those moments where every writer has it, where just something pops into your brain and says, you must get this out of your head. So I went, and it took me 3 years to get it all onto paper, but I got it, and I handed it to a friend of mine who was a director, and he gave me notes, and he loved it, and then he said, "I want to produce this." So we lined up, we pitched it to the local community theater with him directing, and they said, "Okay, we'll do that." And then right before we were due to enter pre-production, he died, and I ended up taking over the job from there, but we did get it off. I think I do still have Bearding the Lions on YouTube if anyone wants to actually take a look at this. And it's a good example of what I was saying, keeping all the action in one place and designing your set so it can work on a very small stage.
Is anyone doing virtual theater right now? I mean, if I wrote something now, no one's going to do any performance.
Yes. In fact, some friends of mine, they have an organization called For the Whim, WHIM, and they just did a play on Zoom, which the Playwright offered an adapted version of the play. I cannot think of the title for the life of me now, but it was such and such Virtual Realms. He added to the title, and it was designed, it's all these people playing D&D over Zoom.
So the play is written to take place in Zoom, which
exactly, that's how he ended up adapting it.
That works. Any other advice you would give if you were writing a play and how to find the theaters is what I'm wondering. Here in the Poconos, there's a local theater that actually has a contest every year, but not this year, where they're looking for new plays. But if you want to leave the Poconos, you want to go elsewhere, is there any service, is there any like local web page or something, or you just do a general Google search and try to find it?
A Google search is probably your best bet. I think one, just give me a second here. I think one resource that I used a lot at the beginning, I just want to make sure that they're still there. Yes, playsubmissionhelper.com.
Okay.
Playsubmissionhelper.com, playsubmissionshelper.com, and they will give you a list every month of opportunities to pitch your submissions.
Is it also a good idea to try to keep the cast small, because it's more likely that they would
Oh,
perform?
yes. Yeah, generally, it's going to change based on your dramatic needs, but generally 6 to 8 characters is probably your best bet, because otherwise you're going to be looking for things for them to do and say, or you're going to just have 1 or 2 characters dominating everything. And theaters nowadays are looking more for good opportunities for women. There's a shortage of plays out there right now with really good female characters. So if you've got a story with a great female protagonist, it might be worth trying to adapt it for the stage.
Is there any other trend we should be looking for? Are they looking for plays with political themes, or are they looking for plays that are comedies? Is there anything that's like standing out nowadays?
Everybody is looking for everything. Everybody is looking for something for their own particular operation. For example, there are some publishers whose bread and butter are schools. And so they're looking for plays with juvenile actors, with relatively unoffensive dialogue, but something that would engage kids. There are gay and lesbian theater groups that are specifically looking for new plays for gays and lesbians. There are people of color. I know there are some theater groups that are looking for First Nations, American Indian stories. Any culture out there, there's going to be someone looking for a play involving it. It's just a question of start with your work. Your work is paramount. Write what you want to write. Don't go chasing what you think other people want to see or want to read. Write what you want to write, and then look for someone who's looking for something like that. And there are so many theaters out there that you might just come across someone.
When you're creating a character for the play, do you usually have an idea in mind? And do you like pretend like a certain actor is that, so that way you can get the dialogue right? I mean, do you say, "Oh, Tom Hanks would be great in this, I'll write it for him"?
I do the same thing when I'm writing a novel, actually, is I picture, okay, if I were doing this as a play, who would I have? And a good example is Morning Has Broken. When I took it to New York, I wrote it with 4 specific actors in mind, and I got 2 of them out of the there's 8 total parts. I managed to get 2 of those actors, and they just fell into their parts because I heard these actors as I was writing the dialogue, and I wrote it for their inflection, for their tone of voice. One of them is a very sarcastic type, so that character ended up being very sarcastic. And then after the table read, when I had only gotten 2 of those 4 characters that I based on other people, I listened to the actors who were reading the dialogue, and then I went back and added new dialogue based on their voices, knowing who I had available. And one thing is, one of the actors that I had for that theater festival, huge fan of Doctor Who, huge fan of everything British, and huge fan of Monty Python. And I had him as one of the characters who are going to be relocating to the UK. And I thought it would just be hilarious when I was trying to flesh out his character more, to have him having second and third thoughts about relocating. So I had the dialogue there. Do I look like someone who belongs in Britain? I hate tea. I don't like the Beatles. Have I ever mentioned anything from Doctor Who or Monty Python? How many TV channels do they have there? 2.5? I don't even like English muffins. And then when we had the next read through, he's trying not to laugh as he's saying this, and everyone else is saying, "Oh, Taylor, that is so not you." But it worked.
So there's a question about, you were mentioning plays for children, and are you talking about children that they can act in, or plays that they would watch at a school? Both.
Mm-hmm. Schools are looking for opportunities for kids to act, and theater groups, a lot of them, their bread and butter is theater for children.
Well, if I can talk personally for a second, when I was in high school, mm-hmm. I actually wrote a musical comedy, and it was called "But I'm Allergic to Horses." And it was about a sheriff who ended up coming into town, or some guy, a nerdy guy coming into town, and they con him into becoming sheriff because, whoop, did I lose you?
Yeah, I have to.
Okay.
My battery's running low. I'm just going to plug it in.
Anyway, while you're doing that, I'll tell my story.
There we go. Okay.
The point was that I wrote this up. I had fun. I got my fellow band members to help me with the music, and the teacher who's in charge of the drama club thought it was great because he didn't have to pay anybody. They didn't have to pay money on this play. And once more, I wrote it in such a way that it all took place in one place, so we only had to build one set. And it was a tremendous amount of fun, and I'd love to do that again. And obviously, I was 16 when I wrote it. I can do much better now, I promise. But it was, I'd love to recapture that again. It was a lot of fun. But you're right. The point I was trying to make is schools are glad to get cheap plays that don't cost them a lot of money because they don't have a budget.
Right, exactly. And if you're writing for small sets and small casts, or even with kids, you can have a relatively large cast. But if you keep it low on tech and low on costume costs, that sort of thing, schools they'll be very happy to give it a try.
Yeah. If the advantage of doing a play about cowboys is all you had to do is get blue jeans and the right shirts, and everyone had their own costume already. How much funding is involved, someone asked, in getting a play produced versus the marketing costs for a book? I mean, how much money are we talking
about?
Well,
it depends on whether you're working with a theater or not. If you're working with a theater, it's going to be in their interest because they're going to be getting all of the ticket revenue.
Are you hearing my cat scream in the background? I'm sorry.
It's all right. I've got one of my own here.
I don't know. He wants some attention. I don't know. Go ahead. Sorry.
But where was I?
I'm sorry. The cat distracted me. Talking about the budgeting for putting on a play.
Oh, budgeting. Thank you. If you've got a theater company, they're probably going to handle a lot of the publicity because it's in their best interest. If you're working with a festival, you're going to have to spend money to promote it yourself. It varies on the size of the theater. It varies on where you're putting it on. Obviously, if you're putting it on in Manhattan, it's not quite cheap to do a lot of publicity. You're not going to get TV or radio, but you can get people handing out flyers on the corners there. Well, before the pandemic, there were people handing out crap on every corner.
Oh, yeah.
In Manhattan. But if you're working with a theater, you're not going to have to worry about the publicity. Production cost, if you're doing it yourself, the entire budget for when we did Morning Has Broken went to housing all the actors in North Jersey, right outside New York, feeding them, getting them to the theater. That was our entire budget. We had $700 to do that. But this was a play that literally they wore their own clothes, and it was just a set of chairs on an empty stage representing a funeral parlor. So if you have elaborate sets, it's going to cost you more.
So advice for a beginning playwright is don't create elaborate sets and elaborate costumes either, because that's going to appeal to a play. I mean, to a theater is going to be more interested, because they'll look at it and say, we can afford to do this. Right.
One good example is I talked. This is not an original play that I'm talking about, but I talked a local theater group into doing The Importance of Being Earnest, because it was public domain. They didn't have to pay the royalties. And my production manager, with all the costumes and the fancy sets that she had designed, ended up going $500 over budgets. So the next season, I agreed to do the comedy with literally no budgets. And I just used what we had on hand. And we did that show for no expenditures. It's possible to do theater for free if you can just go out. I have a theater that's a block and a half from me now, and every year before the pandemic, we were doing Shakespeare in the Park. We would walk across the street to Oak Hill Park, and we'd put on Shakespeare. We wouldn't charge admission, and we'd just take donations, but generally modern dress and no sets, just out there. You can do theater for next to nothing if you're willing to let people's imaginations fill in.
And I think that would work very well with children's theater too, because the children are usually very good,
very imaginative.
Things you don't have to. When I was 10, I was in Aladdin, and I don't remember any sets. I just remember costumes and going around, and the kids in the audience loved it. It's. You're right. All right, we have a couple more questions. We're running out of time. If you don't, speeding through a couple of these questions real quick. Someone asked about other venues. Actually, you sort of mentioned that. Someone mentioned planetariums also look for places sometimes, or look for things. The idea is to break out of the norm of thinking it has to be in an actual theater with a stage. There's always you can create an audience almost anywhere. Correct?
Literally.
Another question is, when writing a play, do you run the dialogue off a friend before you do the read through with the entire cast? I mean, do you generally do that? Do you have like a friend role play the other part to get the dialogue right?
Not usually. It's I will have other people read it, just to read it. But until I get people together for a table read, that's going to be the first time I'm hearing the dialogue spoken by someone other than myself. And I prefer to do it that way because it also gives you a sense of timing, make sure everything is flowing okay. And you're not going to get that if you just have someone read a bit of dialogue aloud to you.
I see.
You need to have as many people as you can actually reading it in real time.
All right, well, we're kind of running out of time here, speaking of time. So in our last few minutes, if you want to give us once more where we can find you, if we want to look up your stuff and your blog, whatever you want to give us at this last minute.
All right, my blog, I haven't really written much in the last couple of years, but it is still there at sungenis.com, sungenis.com. There's also a link there to buy most of my novels. You can find The New Adventures of Queen Victoria at gocomics.com, and just search for Queen Victoria there. I think I'm the only strip that has her, so you never know, though.
Yeah, I check that page every now and then. I think that's the only one. And that's basically it. Thank you, everyone. We will be back in a couple of weeks. I will be posting this up on YouTube very soon. Thanks, everyone, for showing up. I'm going to stop the recording now.
Thank you.